Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We are back live with Rob Rayner. He was a guest probably about a year ago, actually.
I guess so.
Yeah, thanks for joining us again, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, David.
So things have changed a little bit for you, not a great deal. I mean, in some respects, probably very similar kind of work that you're going to be doing or now actually doing and leaving sort of behind. We're going to get into that in a second. Hopefully I've piqued your interest. But one of the things I did notice, so you're working now with the Green Party. I was just thinking about this on the drive in here to meet with you, and your work with basic income and Canada Without Poverty. There seems to be a little bit of a theme here, Rob.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about that theme.
Well, basically, yeah, so I'm working as the interim executive director of the Green Party of Canada, filling in for maternity leave, and the Green Party's values and priority issues resonate with me. And one of those is around basic income or guaranteed income. The Greens are officially already on board with the general concept, recognizing that a lot of details need to be worked out, but I think that was pretty important for me. I just had an opportunity to work for the party for a year and help move things along on the inside, and learn a lot and meet new people within green circles. But the basic income piece remains huge for me.
So tell me a little bit more about basic income. Refresh my memory, the listener's memory, as to you're basically handing off your campaign directorship to someone else in the near future.
Yes.
You've been doing quite a bit of work on this over the last few years.
Yes.
What the heck is basic income?
Sure.
How might it differ from welfare?
Right.
And where are we right now? And then maybe we can talk about the synthesis between your work with Green Party. So executive director interim for Green Party currently as we speak.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
good.
Basic income is a phrase that essentially is meant to mean income that would be provided by governments to citizens with as little conditionality as possible, and with no work requirement. So the idea is to ensure that citizens who are eligible for the basic income receive a level of income that optimally is sufficient to ensure that their basic needs are met, without a requirement for people to have to be working for that income. It may sound like a radical idea, but in fact, there are forms of basic income in place in Canada and around the world, and some of them are very substantial programs. Now in Canada, we have programs more for children and for seniors because there's not a requirement among children or for seniors to work. That's fairly well established in our culture. We have some basic income programs available for the working age population, but they're woefully inadequate. And so we have welfare, which is basically a 19th or 20th century model of social protection with all kinds of flaws and deficiencies and in need of reform. So basic income is an alternative, in particular to welfare, but also to some other types of income security programs that don't work particularly well. And the advantages and the benefits that would flow from basic income are many. Principally health. As many people like to describe it, basic income is really a health income because the link between income and health is profound. And we know from research and evidence, of which we have plenty from within Canada and around the world, that as incomes rise, health outcomes improve. As income falls, health outcomes become worse. And I was just speaking with a doctor today in Toronto. She works for a Sick Kids Hospital. She's a disease specialist, vast knowledge and experience around this area. And she said we are in a major crisis situation in this country with regard to income and health. She called it the long emergency because it's not something that people see like right in front of them, like they will with an infectious disease crisis like SARS, which demanded an immediate response to that short emergency. Poverty is a long emergency.
Well, it's a slow onset crisis.
It's a slow onset,
right?
Yeah. And people suffer it over many years. Their health decreases over many years, and tangibly, many people in fact die, many years younger than they ought to.
Of course, yeah. And in development, this is been a factor for years, mortality rates and so on, and how all connected all of this is.
Yeah.
Why is it so different from welfare? I mean, you talked a little bit about some of the flaws in other income security sort of approaches.
Right.
Is welfare really? I mean, I could certainly pick a few holes in it, I suppose. But is it really about the amount of money that you're getting? Is it the stigma that's attached to it? Are they some of the problems?
Yeah, definitely. Those are the two big ones. It's a stigmatizing process where people have to go into a welfare office, plead their case before a government worker who makes some determinations based on rules, and then there can be further steps in the process even before you even begin to access any income at all. And if you're successful in accessing income, the levels provided pretty much across the board in Canada are really quite low, typically about 2/3 of a poverty income. Newfoundland just announced some serious improvements to their welfare program, including with their rates, that make it the most, if you will, generous of all the jurisdictions. But even still, I don't think anyone would willingly want to be living on welfare in a place like Newfoundland, despite the levels there being the highest in Canada. So the amounts available to people are essentially ensure that people remain in a state of poverty with all the problems that spin out of that. So it's a very poor return on investment, if you will, to use sort of crude financial language. And then the whole process of applying and the documentation and then the follow-up requirements for information that's demanded by the bureaucracy. Huge problems around that. So I think of welfare, there's 5 sort of labels I put on welfare. It's stigmatizing, it's dehumanizing, it's inefficient, it's ineffective, it's inadequate. Any one of those reasons should be enough to demand wide-scale reform, but basic income is none of those things. In principle, it can be adequate. Enough income can be made available. There's no need for it to be stigmatizing. It certainly wouldn't be dehumanizing. If anything, it would be the very opposite. It would help to support the dignity of human beings. And it would be far more effective and far more efficient. So for many of us, we think it's the way to go, and our campaign is pushing for that.
Rob, does anybody choose to be poor? I mean, do you choose welfare? Is it something that you're kind of pushed into or forced into? I mean, I certainly come across that question, all these kinds of people, they must be lazy.
Right.
That's why they're poor.
Right.
Cambodians must be lazy. I mean, I hear these comments, or
Right.
Malawians are lazy. And often I think, it's actually a form of racism on one level, and then I think on another level, it's just somebody who hasn't really done a whole lot of traveling.
Sure.
They haven't been outside of Ontario, or
Sure.
maybe even their Rexdale.
Sure.
So therefore, how could they really know how things are happening on the ground? But they hear things.
Yeah, for sure.
So tell me about the choice side of things, because I'm sure some of your critics are going to say, oh, great. Well, I mean, welfare is low because, people...
Right.
Some people choose this at least, right?
Yeah.
It's the easy way out, isn't it,
Yeah.
Rob? I mean, come on, you're giving me a basic income. You're giving
Right.
me a check to do nothing. Isn't
Right.
that fabulous?
Right. Well, all very good points, and they do come up repeatedly.
I'm sure they do.
Yeah, no, for sure. With regard to who's poor and why they poor, one of our strongest campaign colleagues, a guy named Mark Chamberlain, who's nearby here in Hamilton, done a lot of work in Hamilton with others looking at the poverty situation. And Mark told me last night when I was having dinner with him that, and I've heard him say this before, who's poor in Hamilton? I'll tell you who's poor. It's children, it's seniors, it's people with disabilities, and it's people who are working. And there's not a whole lot of others outside of those 4 major groups. So the belief that people...
That's pretty much everyone, isn't it?
Well, it's capturing most people.
Yeah.
The belief that welfare is something that people are choosing so they can sit at home and do nothing, I think doesn't apply to virtually everybody who in fact is on welfare. But it's worth making the point that laziness, if that's the criticism that's being levied here on people who are poor, laziness exists across the income spectrum, whether or not you're poor or you're rich. It's found right across the income spectrum. It's found right through the workforce. You have people who are employed but who are lazy on the job, who don't have that work ethic that we're all supposed to live up to. So the generalization that those who are on welfare are lazy is just about the crudest generalization that's out there, and it's totally false.
Do you think sometimes folks use these kinds of phrases because they're actually commenting on their own weaknesses?
That's a really good point. It's been made before that when people levy those kinds of accusations or beliefs, what they're actually trying to do is reflect back on the image they want to cast upon themselves. So when someone says, everyone on welfare is just lazy, if they only worked harder, they wouldn't be poor. It's almost like they're trying to reflect upon themselves, like, look how hard I work, I'm not like that.
That's right.
It makes me wonder to what extent this kind of language, these kinds of beliefs, really go very deep into our human psyche and our own need for affirmation about our own.
The whole, I don't know. I mean, for me, on some level, it's there's something connected here to self-interest. Mm-hmm. I'm not like that.
Yes.
I'm not lazy, or maybe even, boy, wouldn't it be great to have a basic income?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean,
and I could get up at whatever time I want.
Well, in fairness, basic income would give people more freedom. That's a big reason why we want it. We want people to feel a greater sense of freedom and autonomy to make the decisions that they can make that will likely be better choices for themselves.
Well, doesn't it presuppose that poverty on some level is some kind of a trap? That poverty is, or at least economic poverty, that is, because I think what I like about and what I know about basic income is that it's way more holistic than just saying this is an economic thing or this is an economic problem or distinction. This is about opportunity, it's about access, it's about the ability to make choices, because you may want to choose A over B, but because of your 3 jobs that you're holding,
absolutely,
you can't access it.
Absolutely. I know myself. Look, I've had a number of ideas for things I'd like to probably try in terms of a very small business. Like, I love books, for example. Now we're in the...
Okay, I want to do a coffee shop and a bookshop
someday.
Yeah. That probably has a smoking room for cigars, I think, and maybe pipes or something like that. And who knows what else, depending on what happens with our government. But, that's kind of, what I with my wife, someday. So anyway, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it many times.
That
I can imagine living in a smaller community, because I've had experience living in small communities and I like them. But how would I make a living? Well, what if I could offer, I love books, I'd love to promote reading, and I also love music, so it'd be, we had some great bookstores in Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto, where they all closed due to market circumstances, I guess. The Nicholas Hoare bookstore chain, they only had 3 stores, but they were the best bookstores in Canada, in my view. Just the way they were laid out, the way they presented the books in a beautiful way, and the music they played and all the rest of it. And that would kind of interest me to do something like that, but I'm not in position to take the risk to do that. I'm just not. Basic income provides that greater cushion that people can take those kinds of risks, knowing that if they ultimately fail with their business venture, they're not actually going to also be starving. So I think many of us believe that basic income, yes, it'll give rise to all these psychological changes and allow people to be thinking very differently about how they can lead their lives and the work that they can pursue that currently they don't do because out of fear and a sense of entrapment in their current circumstance.
So just because there's little conditionality, as you said earlier, with respect to basic income, or there's no work requirement, that doesn't mean that people aren't necessarily going to work. Quite the contrary.
I think it's quite the contrary.
Okay.
And as some of our campaign colleagues have pointed out, the rich don't stop working, generally speaking. They keep working because they love what they do. And if you love what you do, you're going to pursue it. I mean, look at Steve. In my presentation this morning out in Niagara region, I, for the first time, put up a slide of Steve Jobs and a quote, and he talks about, in order to work well and to deliver well, you must follow your passion. If you follow your passion, and work at what it is you love to do, the chances are you're going to do beautiful work with beautiful outcomes. And many people have talked along these lines, but I think it's very, very true. If you're able to follow whatever passion you have and work at that, you're going to keep doing it. Whether great painters don't stop painting, even though their paintings can sell for $1 million or whatever. Great musicians keep. Paul McCartney's still touring the world despite being a billionaire.
Yeah, true.
The Rolling Stones are still on tour despite being
Not sure why they are, but that's
well, we could get into that too. But all kinds of examples of that, of people who are already very successful, could stop working today, but don't because they love to work.
So my listeners and most people who know me know that I'm not a conservative, but I'm going to play that for a second. So Rob, lovely idea, but who's paying for all this?
Okay.
So yeah, aren't my taxes going to go up? And I just heard about Hudak's tax cuts that he's promising here in our part of the world. Tell me more about that.
Very good question. In order to fund basic income at the level that would be necessary for it really to make a difference for people, we certainly have to find the revenue to support that. Fortunately, there are all kinds of ways that revenue can be generated to make that happen. I've just recently come across information from an economist out in Victoria who's very supportive of basic income. She's done some analysis of all the existing tax credits that have been put in place in recent years, and most of these are boutique tax credits. They're targeted to particular niches of our society. And I think as a political tool to win the support of those demographic groups when it's time to cast their vote. But the total value of all those tax credits, and there's over 200 of them at the federal level, is over $100 billion. That's $100 billion of revenue the federal government is not collecting that could be available to help support things like basic income and other critical things we need in our society. That's being foregone. And
$100 billion?
$100 billion. And I wanted to underscore, like the conversation I had with the physician this morning, who's a disease specialist, as I mentioned, but has a lot of contacts and connections with the pediatric world. She mentioned that the incidence of mental illness among children in Canada, and particularly among low-income children, it's right off the scale. And these children and their families need an incredible amount of support if this mental illness is going to be arrested. And this is part of the long emergency that she was describing. Well, we need to change the conversation around taxation, because for decades now, people on the right have been singing the song that with paying less taxes will lead to a better society. It's actually just about the polar opposite, that the level of taxation we're willing to support, up to a reasonable amount, can then provide the revenue we need to invest in all kinds of social supports, infrastructural supports, environmental protections, and so forth. And this is well documented in the literature, in evidence going back now many decades. Societies that are prepared to put up a larger share of revenue into the public pool for investing in those critical things we need as a society generally do much better.
I actually said to somebody, a friend of mine who is quite fiscally conservative, I wouldn't say he's conservative on all levels, that yesterday, that I don't think we pay enough tax.
Right.
And he wasn't thrilled with that, and thought it was pretty ridiculous statement, really. But I think the point I was trying to make is that we've got this infrastructure, we have access to a lot of services and so on, and resources, and alongside of that comes this expectation. And it's really, to me, kind of contradictory and paradoxical that we want to pay less tax and yet still seem to have access to, well, what do you mean the community center's closed, or that the nets aren't up at the tennis court? And I'm being very superficial here at this point. But it's a real paradox to me. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But
well, I think part of the challenge for us in Canada, as elsewhere in the world, is reframing the perspective and the discussion around taxation. And there are people who are working on that. Groups like Canadians for Tax Fairness, Alex Himmelfarb, the former clerk of the Privy Council during the Chrétien years is coming out with a book on his ideas around reforming our tax system. There's some very good minds have been thinking about this stuff for quite a long time, and there's lots of proposals out there for how we could amend our tax system to make it fairer, ensure we have more revenue available for the critical things we need. And some economists have pointed out that the size of our federal government today and the amount of revenue it's generating and the amount of spending that it's giving as a proportion of our GDP is not at an all-time low, but compared to say the 60s or 70s, it's far below that.
Right.
So there's lots of room for us to bounce back, if you will, and
Right. So in other words, the taxes that we may need to pay in the future for X, Y, and Z actually would really get us back to more of a level playing field.
Where we used to be.
Where we used to be.
Yeah.
Why is it, Rob? And then I want to talk a little bit about your shift into working with the Green Party and how that's all connected in the thread and so on. Why don't we reduce, it seems, most conversations to financial equations, mathematical equations? So Rob Ford seemingly, and maybe this has just become a trite consideration, but Rob's okay because he saved us $4 billion, or as a city, or whatever it was. I don't know how much money he saved. I can't remember the number exactly, but that's his argument. Well, look what I did for you economically. Doesn't matter that I'm morally bankrupt, but I saved you a lot of cash. So therefore, I mean, I'm assuming you have an issue with that, but have we reduced it to just dollars and cents?
Well, I don't think we have. It may appear to be that way, but I think, and maybe it's the circles that I run in, but I hardly know anybody who actually really thinks that way.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, maybe again, it's just the company that I keep, but I think we are so intensely social creatures who depend on our interaction. The quality of our interaction with each other is what makes for a happy existence. I don't think we are at all anywhere near the level of just automatons going about our daily business with crude calculation of economic pluses and minuses. Although it may seem that way because so much of our discourse and so much of our media coverage seems to be around those kinds of things, sort of cold dollars and cents. I think Rob Ford is just appealing to a very, very low common denominator when he's talking that way. I don't think he's not a sophisticated individual, and by that I don't mean an elitist kind of person. I think he just thinks in very simplistic ways. Doesn't see the world in the broader way that we need to be seeing, because it's a complex world, and human beings are complex. We have the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we need to address all of those. And when you get into the more emotional and social needs, that's when things like creating and supporting green space and walkable communities and jobs that have meaning, all those things are important, and they're all those things we need to be working on. And basic income is an enabler for a lot of that stuff. It is just simply a tool, but
drives me crazy when we redact everything to numbers.
Oh yeah,
it makes me crazy.
Sure.
And we are not born out of a mathematical equation, and yet, in 9 to 5, and maybe, I've wondered sometimes, Rob, if we kind of live our lives in a particular way from 9 to 5 because we're getting paid money to do it. So there are things that we would do during a work day, the arguments we might get ourselves into, the things we might say in email, how we protect our own asses, how we, I'm going to CC everyone here because I don't want to lose this job. Things that we would do in that framework that we would never do after hours, that we would never do to our neighbors or to the people that we work with on the soccer committee and so on and so on. And I wonder if there's something, there's an angle there with respect to this whole idea of basic income. Well, it's all about the numbers, and I don't know. I'm just kind of talking out loud here on this one, but I wonder if there's kind of a connection to that.
No, I think so. I think there's a big connection. And I think, again, just like we have to reframe conversation and thinking around taxation, I think we have to really reframe ourselves around values and what's really important in life. To reduce life and human life or Canadian life in Canada to just raw numbers is unfortunate, and it just takes away the focus of where we really need to be.
Which just seems wrong.
Yeah.
On so many levels. I
Yeah.
love, and I don't know if we were recording at this point, but our initial chat about your visit with this doctor in Toronto, or your phone conversation, it sounded to me like she was talking about access to more human contact. From what you said, and this idea that we are more than just poverty is way more than that. We are made up of we're way more complicated than X plus Y equals Z.
Yeah, and she was talking about the 4 big areas that have to be addressed: the income, that's where basic income comes in; housing. She called it a place to call your own,
Right.
whatever that means, but a place
Right.
that feels
Sure.
like
Yep.
a sense of home. Social supports of all kinds, including the kinds of human contact that we're talking about here, which could be having a social network of friends, people who will call on you that you like to invite to have over, as well as the more technical supports in our society for particular needs that people have. And then the 4th one was a sense of purpose.
A sense
Purposeful
of purpose
activity.
is huge. I mean, we're talking about relationships. I mean,
Yeah.
all of them kind of have the relational thread running through
Sure.
them, which I think is really brilliant. My daughter Victoria, we have not far from where we live. There's been some new zoning laws that have just been, I guess, re-articulated, and so building is now starting. And we've been in this area for about 11 years and kind of been saved from a lot of construction, and now it's starting and homes are going in, etc. We had a lot of fields just a kilometer north of us. We could hear coyotes at night, and now that's all changing. And so we were driving around not far from our house, and we saw some cranes, not cranes, shovels, and the fences were going up. And Victoria said, basically the paraphrase was, too much construction going on. The quote was, they need to build more fields. I just thought that was brilliant.
Yes.
And I think the Green Party, could that be a campaign strategy for the Green Party? They need to build more fields.
Oh, I love the turn of phrase. That's great.
Isn't it wonderful?
Or they need to build more forests, or they need to build more rivers, or whatever. Because definitely. I think so many of our problems relate to design. How we're designing things. Why are we designing these housing tracts that are sort of monolithic, if that's the right word, or monochromic, or
Sure.
monochromatic?
Yep.
Are we designing? Doing physical design of neighborhoods and communities in such a way that both short-term and long-term is really going to be good for people's health? I love the idea myself of sort of mixed development, where you've got shops and housing right there together, like on the ground floor of the shops, and above are 3 levels of housing, or three-story. So it's compact to a point, but it's also very human scaled. We don't see nearly enough of that. Like in Ottawa, I'm seeing all around us are the same types of development probably you're seeing, that you're describing here.
Yep. Seeing a little more of that, what you're talking about in Toronto, certainly with some of the new condo developments,
there
which
is
are
some.
probably creating some other issues, I would imagine.
Yeah.
But not seeing a lot of it certainly in suburban communities, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So tell me about, so you've shifted to working with the Green Party. You told us a little bit about why you're doing that. Can you tell me a bit more about maybe the thread that runs through all the things that you've been doing I kind of asked you about that right out of the gate in the conversation.
Right.
But there seems to be, you seem to have a concern for others, or a concern for the environment, and when I say environment, I don't just mean building more fields, but social environment, and so on. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, the Green Party for me is a really good fit. As I mentioned, like my values align with the formal Green values, there's 6 of them. And I guess everybody in the Green Party around the world, the Green Parties around the world, is more or less has to, abide by or identify with those values, which I do. But I just think we live in a very deeply troubled world. And the trend lines in almost every respect are not encouraging, from climate change to inequality. We look what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine, deeply disturbing things that are happening on that front. Generally speaking, I think it's a very, very, very troubled world that we now live in, and that our children and our grandchildren are inheriting. So we have to do everything we can to try to reverse some of the damage that's been caused, try to prevent further damage, and just generally live a whole lot more intelligently than we've been doing. And that begins with our values. We have to value things that are truly important and let go of those things that truly are not important. So it's not important to become a millionaire. It's not important to acquire as much as you can for yourself. It is important to have comfort and a decent standard of living and to have friendships and the quality of your human relationships. Those are the things that really do matter. It's important that we have good quality of food that everyone can access, and that the soil and the land that is available to us for for food production, that gets protected. There's just so many things to work on in this broad context. The Green Party kind of stands for all of that, and I think stands more clearly than the other parties. Each of the other parties may have their strengths, but I think for me the Green Party...
Even the Conservatives?
Yeah, I would say even the Conservatives. To be fair, I think there's elements of conservatism that I think are okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that I would ever go there myself, but I think, actually, historically in Canada, it was the Conservative Party that was my understanding was the Liberals at the time were when Canada was really just kind of getting going, it was the Liberals who were the more elitist, sort of right of center, and it was the Conservative Party who...
Interesting.
Now, that I could be wrong.
Well, I know from an international ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, and during Private Mulrooney's era was, I think, the time that Canadians have been the most generous ever since that 0.7 number that was set back in the 50s with 50s or 60s with Pearson.
Yeah, and in the States, the time of Lincoln, it was the Republican Party was more on the side of the people and social justice than the Democratic Party. Eisenhower was a very respectable president who, as a Republican president, carried on Roosevelt's traditions and so forth. So we can't overly generalize, but no, for me the Green Party is just a really good fit. But it's still a very young party. It's only got 2 MPs. Very difficult to get traction in our first past the post electoral system. It grossly disadvantages a party like the Green Party in terms of the strength it ought to have in the House of Commons. Like if we had a system of proportional representation in the 2000 election, I think we would have had something like 12 to 15 MPs in the House right now. But instead we got 1 elected, and then Bruce Heyer, who was elected as a New Democrat, left that party sometime in 2013, became an independent, and then in January of this year came over to the Green side. So we have...
And is that going to change, do you think? Do you think that's ever going to change, the way we do government here in Canada?
Well, that's a great question on at least 2 levels. One is the Green Party very much tried to get the NDP and the Liberals to cooperate on competing in the next federal election with the understanding that only one representative from one of those parties would compete against the Conservatives. So the idea was that if the Greens had a really strong candidate in this riding, the Liberals and the New Democrats wouldn't run someone against that candidate. And if the Liberals had a really strong candidate in a riding, the New Democrats and the Greens wouldn't run against that individual. So it would basically come down to a progressive candidate versus the Conservative candidate. Unfortunately, the Liberals and the Democrats, under their leaders, are not supporting that proposal. And the idea was to do it one time only, so that progressives, if you will, I'm not really happy with that term, but I'll just use it because it's kind of out there, but progressively minded politicians would outnumber the conservative minded politicians in the House, therefore making it possible to introduce move to some form of proportional representation, which would give us much better, much more representative reflection of where people are at politically in Canada. With first past the post, as virtually everybody knows, it grossly skews the allocation of seats. So you end up with farcical situations where parties won 39% of the vote and it gets 62% of the seats, something like that.
Right.
And that's a problem in every province in Canada, every territory. We don't have a system of proportional representation anywhere, and so we're getting these lopsided results where, a minority of votes and you get a majority of seats, and then you govern with arrogance. And despite this conservative government has been opposed by 6 out of every 10 people eligible to vote. yet they've got a majority now going on 9 years next year. So.
In my, I don't know what it is, 32 years of voting, I have voted for every party except for the communists, and I'm a big fan of the Communist Manifesto. I'd like to point that out. I have spoiled my ballot for a few years. I voted for Greens for several elections in a row, and I'm not boasting. I'm just leading into this idea. I think I've landed on, wouldn't it be time better spent, money better spent to say, let's vote alongside the party that we think is at least going to affect the most change today, rather than investing in a party that doesn't seem to have that because the system is so broken. So I guess the question is, where can you do the most good? Right? And so there's a couple questions here, I think, Rob, and is your involvement with the Green Party, and is the Green Party's involvement with the Green Party really about hope and about really what it could be like, rather than, okay, well, I'm going to get involved with the Liberals because at least they seem like maybe we're an election or two away from at least getting the Conservatives out.
Again, it's a very good question. And my own political trajectory has been, I started with the Green Party of BC in the 80s when it was just getting going. When I moved to New Brunswick, I joined the New Democrats, and I was a New Democrat candidate in 1997.
Wow.
But in New Brunswick, it's a two-party province for the most part, Liberals, Conservatives, and if you want to serve in politics, you pretty much, at this point in time, you need to think about joining one of those two parties, because the other parties have a great deal of time getting any traction in that particular jurisdiction. So I joined the Liberals because I knew the New Democrats really did not have a strong chance of ever really electing somebody in the area I was in. So it was a rural riding. It was staunchly conservative for the most part, but there have been some Liberal breakthroughs. So I sought the Liberal nomination federally and provincially. So I've kind of migrated and wandered now back to the Greens. Justin Trudeau said something the other day which I think was great. He said people should join the party of their choice based on the values that they see in that party. And I think that's correct. So that's what I've done. I think every party would say that they're the party of some hope. The political process, I think, is vital that people get involved. I would encourage anyone to do it. The reality is when you're in the thick of it, a lot of it is day-to-day kind of crisis stuff, and the sort of the longer-term visioning and promotion of ideas and values, I think, often really happens more on the outside of formal political parties, and that's important work. But where's the best place for a person to put their time is up for everyone to decide. From my point of view, it's equally valuable to spend your time staying at home and caring for a loved one as it is to run for the political leadership of a political party.
Absolutely, yeah.
Small acts of kindness add up to the world that we have.
Yeah.
And I'm struck by that virtually every day. I stayed in a bed and breakfast last night in Thorold, near St. Catharines, and the owners were great. And small act of kindness, they gave me 2 muffins this morning to take with me. And in fact, this entire trip, I've had nothing but acts of kindness, from the friend who put me up in Kingston a couple of nights ago, to the dinner that I was treated to last night, to the coffee that another individual bought me yesterday. Small acts of kindness, and they all add up into the beautiful world that we know is possible. So we should never think that those small acts don't count. They actually count for everything.
You don't sound cynical enough to be the executive director of the Green Party. You're now in the middle of politics. You're in the heart of it, Rob.
No, I fight against cynicism. I've pledged to myself I'm not going to end up bitter and cynical about the world, even though there's lots of reasons to be discouraged.
So NDPs, Liberals, you've run as a candidate. Have you found that politics is unfortunately populated by a group of cynics? I mean, are people in it for the right reasons?
I think a lot of people aren't, and I say that in fairness to all concerned and all parties, because I have had experience within 3. I think definitely a lot of people get involved in politics for the wrong reasons. It attracts people, and I remember someone telling me this years ago before I ever got politically involved. I remember an individual saying to me that politics tends not to attract the right people, and that the people who you think would be most appropriate to serve in politics don't get involved in politics because they perceive it as being this arena of conflict and self-interest and self-dealing and all this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of truth in that. At the same time, I've met some amazing people who have been
Yeah, I
involved
bet.
in the political process, both people who've been elected into the House of Commons. There's some very, very fine individuals involved there, and people who work in the back rooms.
I remember as a kid, and I don't remember where I heard this, it could have been Sunday school, but the idea that it's a lot easier to pull somebody down from a pedestal than it is to pull somebody up. And I don't know where that comes from. Sounds sort of like Shakespeare to me as well, or Mark Twain maybe. I bet it's the same in politics, right? You get in for the right reason. It's like working in the nonprofit sector, frankly. I mean, I know a lot of people who work with some large NGOs who I don't think are there for the right reasons. They're there for the paycheck and the security and the
Sure.
dental plan.
Yep.
They're not there because they're driven by the fact that it's wrong, it's morally wrong that 2 billion people live on less than $2 a day, or whatever the case might be. Maybe they got in for those reasons, but things have changed along the way. And I'm not necessarily casting judgment. Things change. People's lives change. But it's hard to maintain that level of hope and seeing life the way you've seen it over the last couple days. You know, acts of kindness rather than an expectation.
Yeah, and again, going back to your earlier point about reducing everything to a monetary or fiscal calculation. Yeah, when you actually step back and look at one's own life and you think about all the acts of kindness and generosity that we
It's astounding.
It's astounding.
Actually,
It's
is.
astounding
For most of us, maybe not everyone, but I think
Yeah.
it is for pretty much all of us.
Yeah, and it would be nice to think that everyone could really step back and just be thankful for all that has been given. Of course, not everybody is in that frame of mind, and as we see repeatedly, there are, so many people are still in a very acquisitive, get more for themselves kind of mindset, and it can be very discouraging in politics, as it can be in any field, to see this kind of behavior. But I think we're coming up against that human element, and there's, human nature. We do have this ugly side of us, the dark side, the greedy side, the self-interested side, and then we have this other amazingly generous. And
So I just read in the Globe a couple days ago about a couple scholars who are doing a lot of work around genocide, and how they're saying, things have changed, and there are fewer genocides occurring today than
Right.
there were so many years ago,
Right.
and there's fewer people who have died in the last 15 years than in the last 25, and so on. So, and then I've got other people who are in my life saying recently, and a couple of weeks ago, well, really, nothing's changed, has it? I mean, we're still killing each other and so on. And I think that it's so easy, it seems, to reduce these things to the, like you said, physical, but also just an either or. It's positive, it's negative, it's, the way things used to be, you can get nostalgic, or you can actually be hopeful and say, hang on, things are changing.
For sure.
We are making a difference.
Yeah.
And it's time to focus more on the acts of kindness. I think, we're going to have to wrap it up shortly, Rob, but, you talked about reforming our tax system. And I think you talked about the idea of redefining or understanding what it means to pay tax in a new way. And maybe that's kind of the metaphor for what we're doing, or what you're doing with basic income and what you're doing with the Green Party. It's about asking new questions,
Right.
and about, tearing down the old structures, not
Right.
just because, but because there's something better.
Yeah, definitely. I think we do need to ask different questions. We do need to, think outside the box has now become a bit of a cliche. But
Yeah.
I think it's very true. We very easily get ourselves boxed in by the ways we've been instructed to think, or the way we believe we're supposed to think, and it can be hard. It can be hard to find the space, literally the space, to be able to think creatively. But we desperately need it. We need creative people to come forward in all kinds of ways to help propose the solutions. There was a wonderful phrase, I forget who said it, or I don't know who said it. In order to have, I think it was Linus Pauling said, in order to have a really good idea, you have to have lots of ideas.
Right.
So lots of ideas in the pool, and from that will surface the handful that in fact are true winners, right? I happen to believe that basic income is one of those ideas. Other people believe it, but we have lots to learn about it. We don't have all the answers as yet, but we also know more about what doesn't work well, say when it comes to addressing poverty. So as always, it's going to be some trial and error and feeling our ways along, but very central to all that has to be this spirit of giving and generosity. If we don't have that, it's very difficult to create the kind of world that we're seeking if we're truly all out just for ourselves and to hell with everybody else. So.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us today. Very nice way to end it. And as I always say, there's so much more going on here than meets the eye. We barely scratched the surface.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, David.